All right. Welcome to the World of Art and Magic podcast, where we talk to creatives about their inspirations behind their work and the symbolism and hidden meaning in our favorite games, films, or comics. My name is Wes. I'm an illustrator and a comic artist. You can find my work as well as Joe's work here in the description link below. Today, I have the creator of Reaper Destroyer on Indiegogo. Why don't you give us a brief introduction, Joe?
Hey everybody, my name is Joe M Sonntag. Can't forget the M because it sounds fancy. I am the creator, artist, writer of the book Reaper Destroyer that is on Indiegogo right now, in demand, by the way. Also, former band member, so definitely got music in my background. A lot of people like to give me. Can we swear in this?
Go,
or
go for it.
or keep it family friendly. People like to give me
Just
shit for that. It's become a running joke on my show specifically because I always talk about being in the band. But yeah, this is what I'm trying to do. I got a company called Superior Press putting out my first book called Reaper Destroyer, which is the flagship book of the company, and hopefully will grow into many more titles to come.
okay, cool, man. Yeah, so you're like what, $50 away from $60,000 raised on your first comic?
Yeah, I
That's
think I'm $60 away from 65K raised on the first comic, which is insane for a first timer, from what I've been told. And I gotta say, every time I talk about it, it's a staggering number to think about, and it's a completely humbling experience that many people came out to back the book. And the 65K it's a cool number to put out there, but the thing I'm really proud of is the number of backers. To go over 1,000 backers, I think there's 1,065 backers. I think currently on the campaign, something like that.
mhm.
To me, that was really impressive to me, and that was a goal I was really stretching to get to, was that 1,000 backers, because it sounds good to say 1,000 people back the campaign. So that's really more important to me than 65K, even though that's really cool for a first timer to come out and say, hey, look at this comic did this, or this campaign did this. Apparently we clicked with the right people at the right time, and it was a concept in art design and character design and all that stuff that people dug. So it's been an awesome experience. Almost done with the book, almost ready to get it out. I believe that we're going to be shutting down the campaign, I think, in September or late September. So everybody's still got like over a month to back the book if they want to. But we're going to probably be bringing it down at the end of September, and hopefully getting ready to go into the fulfillment, which is going to be a chore in itself with that many backers. But looking forward to it.
I imagine. Yeah, I came across your work on Twitter, and what I really liked about it was is that you have this really good mix of different inspirations that I saw like right off the bat. Like Spawn, definitely. I'm a huge Spawn fan. Spawn made me want to get into comics.
Yes,
I
sir.
mean,
Yeah.
it's the greatest comic in my opinion. Um, Spawn. I see some Jim Lee influence, Legacy of Kain in the design. That's what it feels like to me. Joe Mad as well. I feel like there's a little bit of a Joe Mad influence there, or maybe artists that are tangentially related
Yeah, for
to
sure.
those.
I think it's really cool when people look at my art, because I'm all the time compared to many different artists, which I like. I like that fact, that people say, "Hey, you remind me of this guy. You remind me of this guy," and there's a majority, like a lot of people were like, "Hey, you remind me of Silvestri." I get that quite a bit. Which I'm not on Silvestri's level, by the way. Anybody that's watching this, just know that I'm not on Silvestri's level whatsoever. But to be compared to him is very cool, because he is one of my biggest influences and idols. But growing up, I was huge into just comic book art in general. Like when I got into comic book art when I was a kid, like around 10 years old, 10, 11, 12 was probably the age where I was really like falling in love with drawing comic book art, and learning who artists were and following their work. And throughout my life, I would just fall in love with different artists, so many over the times. I never fall out of love with any artist. I would just add another,
Hmm.
influence into my stuff. And my style just kind of is an amalgamation, I would say, of like 20 different artists that I all at one point in time just loved what they were doing and started drawing like them. And then somebody else would come along and start drawing like them. And eventually I was starting to draw my own style that was incorporating everything. So when people say, "Hey, reminds me of Silvestri, reminds me of Capullo," somebody's like, "It reminds me of Will Portasio," and like a lot of artists I wasn't even maybe directly influenced with, but I enjoy the fact that people can get that out of my style. That it just kind of it's I take it that it's at least a style that catches people's attention, and that's what I am. I take pride in that fact.
Yeah, it's got kind of a '90s vibe to it, you
Absolutely,
know.
yeah. All my
Yeah.
influences were from the '90s. I definitely do. I'm trying not to be like a '90s rip-off artist, but influences are influences, right?
Mhm.
All my heroes were influenced by people from the '80s and '70s, and so on
Mhm.
and so forth. If you go farther back, so you can definitely track the influences off of my art. I'm trying to do like a modern day version of the dynamics of the '90s, I guess you could say, with
Mhm.
my style, because I feel like the style is quite a bit missing in comics today. There's a bunch of or a few old school names that are still jamming and still doing their thing, like Brett Booth and David Finch. Guys that came up in the '90s and just are still doing their stuff. But for the most part, I think comic book art has gone a different direction than the dynamic, over exaggerated art style that was so popular in the '70s, '80s, and '90s, specifically the '90s. And I noticed that when I started putting my work out there, I was getting a ton of compliments and people coming out saying like, "Hey, like I miss this style of art. Or, like this is what I love. Like this is what comics should look like. I can't wait for your book. Or, your character design is awesome." And I was like, "All right, well, I'm really clicking with people that aren't getting this specific thing anymore in the industry." And it seemed to work because I mean, people came out and backed the book, are still backing the book, and I'm hoping I can just bring that little my love, my passion to everybody else, and hopefully that's going to spark some more interest and excitement back into the industry if people have lost it.
Yeah. So, do you think that comics have, I mean, have they become too politicized? Like, what is it that has changed about them? To be honest with you, I make my own comics, which I have some for free that in the description below. Um, but they're based off of, like science fiction, strange
Yeah,
tales, that sort of thing.
right.
I don't keep up with the modern comic scene to be honest with you.
I don't either, and a lot of people I talk to don't as well, and not because like you've outgrown it or whatever, but yeah, comics have become too political. What was cool about comics in the '90s or when I was growing up, even in the early 2000s when I was still heavily collecting comics, was that the stories were focused on the character and the character development and what's going on in their story, how do decisions affect them, their own decisions, other people's decisions, and is a progressing story, and it's stuff that you could get into a story, you could relate to a story, you become part of that fantasy world, and lately, I guess over the last, I mean, really heavily over the last like 5, 7 years, but probably over the last 10 or so years specifically, politics and ideologies have been creeping into mainstream comics. Mostly, I look at it as a bunch of activists took over writing and producing comics in the mainstream and Marvel, DC, and they go in and they change the characters up to fit their ideology or their political beliefs or religious or
Hmm.
lack of religious beliefs, whatever you want to say, and they start projecting themselves into the characters. And I had a conversation with a guy whose show I was on not too long ago, and we kind of talked about a similar thing. And I was just talking about like how when you have a character that's been established for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, you fall in love with that character. You know how they think, how they're going to deal with a situation, and you like to see them work within their world, within who they are. And now all of a sudden, these people come in and like, we're going to change these characters. They're going to think a little bit different. They're going to talk different. They're going to look at the world different. And basically,
Hmm.
is they're going to look at and act the way that these people do in real life. Like if you go on their social media and you see how they talk on social media, that's how these characters are now talking and acting. And that was a big thing that it drove a lot of people away because that's not what comics are about. Comics should be an escape. It's escapism. You want to read a comic to fall into a fantasy world, whether it's sci-fi, horror, action, superhero, whatever. But you don't want to see the real world, real stuff going on reflected in the comic books. Like you don't want to see the politically correct stuff or like having to add this many gay characters or transgender characters or gender
Hmm.
swapping or race swapping or like all this stuff to appease whatever, and then being told that if you don't like it, are the problem. You, the reader, are the problem. The consumer is the
Hmm.
problem. You're the racist. You're the blah blah blah, and it became just kind of really a toxic place, and it's still like that today. Which is why I championing the independent scene a lot more, because I feel like that's where you can go to get the just strictly people who are making books to make books to tell good stories, not to try to put their own personal beliefs. I mean, I'm sure it does happen in the indie scene, but for the most part, we just want to make a story out there that's going to appeal to everybody.
Hmm.
The idea of creating the characters so that everybody can relate to that character, relate to their struggles, to their missions, whatever it is they're going through. And that's the beauty of comics, and that is absolutely what is not going on in the mainstream these days.
Which is it's so weird because it seems like it's become a part of everything now. Like it seems like a legitimate push to get everybody on the same political bandwagon.
Oh,
You see
yeah.
it in our films now. Obviously in comics. I can't really think of any good examples in games, but
I mean,
um,
there have been issues with games, and I'm not really a gamer per se, but I've heard people talk about certain games of them doing similar things, like what The Last of Us, with some of their characters, I guess, pushing them in different directions or just whatever. But it's all over our entertainment, and unfortunately, like these people, these activists or whatever, they basically run the entertainment industry, and that eventually found its way into comics. And I mean, comics was always kind of seen, or correctly or not, as kind of like a boys' club, right? Like usually it was
mhm.
primarily boys and men that collected comics and liked it, even though there was a good group, women liked it as well. It just wasn't known. So people were like, well, let's come in there and let's change it up. Like let's gear it towards this, let's gear it towards that. And the problem is when you come in to do that kind of a big change, you forget the people that actually fuel the financial backing of an industry when
Mhm.
you shift away from them. It's almost kind of like Bud Light. Like Bud Light just had that big mess up,
Yeah.
pissed a bunch of people off because they basically are like, we want to gear away from the consumers that have been paying us and drinking Bud Light for decades now and try to appease this audience, and boom, fell flat on its face. I wish that would happen with the comic book industry and other stuff. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Because
Yeah.
honestly, these companies are like Disney owns Marvel.
Yeah.
Who is it owns DC? It used to be Warner Brothers. Now it's somebody. But
Mhm.
like they make enough off of the IPs of the characters for movies that it doesn't matter what the comics do anymore. The comics can have shitty
Mhm.
sales, which they do, and they're not going to shut down the comic book division because it doesn't matter for their overall bottom line. They're making enough off the movies. Even if the movies don't do well, they're still making money off of all these IPs that they can take and repackage and put all over the place, and cartoons and movies, whatever. So
Mhm.
that's the problem with the industry. Like there's no fear in the industry that they're worried about. They can have the shittiest sales, comic book sales. They can cancel books left and right, come back out with a number one, and nothing happens. The industry just keeps on going forward because the people that own them really don't give a crap about the comic book branch of them. So it's I don't ever see it changing anytime soon. Unfortunately, like Bud Light, that was a big backlash, and that was awesome. Like regardless of
Mhm.
whatever side
Mhm.
of the spectrum you land on, that when you go away from the consumer, the people that are putting money into your pocket on a regular basis and for years, and you disrespect them by doing something completely different, and then go after those people and tell them that they're in the wrong and they're wrong for it, that's what should happen. And unfortunately, it hasn't happened in the comic book industry just yet.
Yeah, it's really crazy going back and watching like some old George Lucas interviews before he sold Star Wars, and he's talking about like his experience of like they're saying, "Yeah, George, you're going to be a part of this whole thing, and we're
Oh
really
yeah,
going to
yeah.
expand." And then as soon as I got a hold of it, they're just like they're not returning his calls. They don't care at all, and
Oh,
they really took like this American symbol and just shit all over it.
oh yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure the money was great for George at the time, and he deserved it. Getting that big payday. So I don't fault him for that. But the fact that he thought that they had some kind of handshake deal in place, where once you sell your product, it's not yours anymore. It doesn't matter if you're the creator and you're the genius of it all, they can replace you at a drop of the hat, and that's what they did. He, I don't know if you've seen it, but I mean, he had a layout of what he wanted the prequel trilogy to be about. It actually sounded pretty cool, like his
Mhm.
idea of what it was going to be about and how the direction they were going to go. And Disney came in, they're like, no, we're going to go in a different direction. We're going to do what we want to do because, we're so smart and we know what the customer wants falsely. And then they give us what we got, and they have basically destroyed Star Wars. I mean, the Phantom, or not the Phantom Menace, yeah, what was number 7 that came out?
Um, the chronology escapes me, to be honest with you.
The first one of the new series.
Okay.
My mind's kind of blank right now when it comes to the
Mhm.
name of it because I try not to pay attention to them because I thought they were all bad. But the first one that came out was pretty nice because that was just kind of like it was exciting to get the old cast back.
Mhm.
A little bit of the nostalgia feel. It kind of followed the New Hope story beats. So it
It
kind of
was
gave you like familiarity.
mhm. It was Force Awakens, right?
Force Awakens, yes. Force Awakens. Yep. That was okay. I don't mind that one. I could still watch that one and be all right, even though the character Rey annoys the hell out of me.
Hmm.
Because, you have to have, strong girl boss character now. It's just,
Hmm.
she has no character development whatsoever in that
Hmm.
movie or any of the other movies. But just to see where they go with it, and what they think the fans want. And really, I don't even think that's what it is. It's what they want the fans to want.
Hmm.
That's the age we're living in. Is they're trying to tell us what we want. You'd be like, no, no, no.
Hmm.
You might want this. You might want to see Luke be all badass and be cool, and use his Jedi power and be like, the master Jedi and do all this kind of stuff. But we're gonna give you broken down, depressed Luke on an island somewhere that doesn't want anything to do with the Force anymore. That's what you really want. That's what we're gonna give you. So it's just, yeah, it's all trash.
Well, what's interesting to me about this whole thing is that it really shows that there's certain mechanics to a story, and if those mechanics are not satisfied, then the viewers cannot connect with the story. Like, so on my YouTube channel, um, do you know who Philip K. Dick is, right? The writer.
Sounds familiar. I don't know if I
Okay,
know
he
specifically his stuff.
he wrote "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep" that got turned into Blade Runner.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, so the comics that I'm adapting, I'm taking short stories of his that are public domain, and I'm turning them into
Nice.
comics, like these kind of Twilight Zone kind of comics. Like this stuff
Yeah.
is really tripped out. But I've been doing these video essays where I go through and I break down Blade Runner and Minority Report as well. And as I'm doing it, I'm reading through this book called The Anatomy of Story, and it's so interesting to me that like there is certain mechanics, the way that characters function within a story, that if they don't function in the correct way, then like I said, an audience can't connect to it. It's like if you have a thriller movie, right? There's a certain expectation that there's going to be a confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist at the end of it,
Right.
and that has to be satisfied. If that's not satisfied, then people are like, I don't know what it is that I'm watching. There's
Yeah.
certain things in every genre that have to be satisfied in order for it to feel like a. It's like taking somebody on a roller coaster ride in a sense. It's like it has to have a climax and then it has to have a finish,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Um, and all this stuff, it seems like a deconstruction of storytelling. It's like this idea that they seem to have this idea that we need to reinvent the wheel in ways that are not creative at all. Like they think they're being creative with these decisions that they're making, but really it's like the most trite thing that you could possibly do. It's like let's make this character gay. Like
Right.
there's nothing wrong with gay characters or gay people, but it's
Right.
like this you're just taking this and you're just putting it into things that it didn't belong there. Why don't you just create something else around it?
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. It's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. Like, if you know the formula for connecting with the audience and telling a good story is this, then do that. And you can, when you do that formula, you can do it in many different ways to make your story unique and different from other stories. But like that is what the audience is expecting. You don't go into, like you said, you don't go to watch the latest Halloween movie to see you know a broken down Michael Myers not be able to do anything. You want to see, Laurie Strode and Michael Myers have the final big battle, like have this big meeting of the two characters, but they want to like subvert your expectations. Why? Because reasons, I don't know, and you leave the audience wanting, and when you
Mhm.
do that enough, people are going to stop coming to the movies or coming reading a book or being excited about stuff. I mean, look at the comic book movies right now. The
Mhm.
comic book movies, when they came out, was something that was fresh, was new. We never saw these characters on the screen before. Technology was advancing, so you could see them do these fantastic things in the theaters. And the it was an event. Everyone loved the fact that the new Marvel movie was coming out, or DC, like all this kind of stuff. And there was a formula there. It was good. It worked. People were excited about it. And then they decided they wanted to subvert expectations and go in different directions and add all these forced stuff within the story that nobody was looking for. Nobody went to the theater to see what they were trying to put into the movies. And that was one of their big mistakes, is you took something that was popular and you're like, well, here's a platform, right? Here's a platform now that I can use to put my ideology and stamp on, and because people love it, they're going to see it, they're going to accept it. And it's like, no, people generally just want to have entertainment. They don't want to be reminded of the real world. They don't want to be told what to think or how to feel when you start bringing in political views or any other kind of view into entertainment. That should be entertainment unless you have a story that's specifically based on some kind of politics or whatever that you're going there specifically to see. If you're going to go see an entertaining adventure movie or fantasy movie, whoever you vote for, whatever you believe religiously, whoever you sleep with, is all left at the door, because you all come into that theater and you sit down together and you're watching this movie that you can all relate to and be excited about. That's what a good story should do. It should not alienate half the people that come and watch it, read it, or whatever. And that's all they do nowadays. Alienate somebody.
So whenever you were making this comic, uh, like, did you come up with like the full arc of the story of this character, or was it more like you have like maybe the beginning part and then you have like the rest kind of sketched out?
Yeah. So when I first developed the character, it was actually back in 2007, and it had quite a bit of different story back then. I was younger at the time, so it was kind of just it was my first kind of foray into trying to create a comic book, and I didn't really know what I was doing back then. I was just kind of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing if it would stick. But when I decided to do it like for real, like get into and try to make it serious and put the book out there, I took a couple years to sit back and retool the story to see how you could expand on stuff to make it more interesting, make it a bigger story, make it more dynamic, all that kind of stuff. And I had an idea of where I wanted to start, and I had an idea what I thought I would finish the arc on, but I had no idea how I was going to get from A to B. And that was something I had to learn. I had to bring on other writers to help me flesh out my ideas, because I still don't consider myself a writer. I consider myself a storyteller
Okay.
that's learning how to write, I guess you could say. So I lean on people that actually write. And my thing was like I didn't know how to develop characters and do story beats and pacing and all that stuff. Like that was not my strength. So I had to lean on other people coming in and help sitting down and taking my ideas, and we would come out. And what really helped me was a writer friend of mine who was attached to the book for a little while would sit down and he just ask me simple questions and make me think about my story and be like, why should the readers care about your character? You're like, I know your character's badass and has these powers and is going to do all this kind of stuff, but why is the reader going to connect with your character? And I would have to sit there and I'd be like, huh. It's like that's something I never thought about before, because I wasn't a writer. Like you're right. Like how am I going to get that reader to connect with whatever struggle the characters got going on or relate to them in certain ways? So I had to kind of learn all that. And it was a fun learning experience to a point where I got very confident in everything I was doing and the direction of the book and the story arc that we were doing. And then I eventually went into like, all right, I'm at a point. Let's produce it. Let's start making the book. And I've got a great idea of the first story. I've got ideas for 25 issues. I've got an expansive world that could go all the way up to 100 issues. From what I've created, because I just created a massive world that's going to be a fun play box to play in. But mainly, I wanted to have a loose idea of what I'm doing, but leave space to be able to tweak things and adjust
Mhm.
stuff as I go. Because one of the big things I loved about comic books when I was a kid, I read an article with Chris Claremont. I don't know if it was in a Wizard magazine or whatever, but in the article, he was talking about how back in the day, in the 80s or whatever, or maybe even 70s, it could be 70s, that Marvel had, they would listen to the fans. They would listen to the letters that they came in, and they would pay attention to what the fans were liking, what they didn't like, characters that they were getting steam and everything. And one of the stories that he told is that when they created the character Colossus, that Colossus was supposed to be the guy. That was the guy that they were going to build the X Men around going forward when he made his debut in what Giant Size X Men #1. But the fans all connected with Wolverine because he was just this cool character, claws, like all this kind of stuff, and they saw the popularity of Wolverine growing. So instead of them pushing a character that didn't click with them and but they liked, instead of pushing them on the fans, they decided to go with what the fans liked and they started pushing Wolverine. And that appeased the fans and they went on and boom, here you go, you have all this great history. I want to do that with my book. I want to keep enough looseness there where I can tweak certain things based on fan reaction from the first issue when I start getting feedback. If so that I can go in and be like, hey, I could just tweak this right here to make this. I didn't think about this before, but because of the reaction of this character, maybe I'll give them a bigger arc. I've already kind of done that a little bit with one of my characters in the book, Apophis, who is he's the spirit of death, and he's kind of he's one of the heroes or villains. He could be either or. We don't know. You'll find out when you read the book. It's wrapped around a mystery. But I started kind of showing the character design of him off to people, and I have a backup story in one of the supplemental books in that you can get on the campaign. And people were kind of seeing that character design and learn a little bit more about his backstory, and he was starting to really take off. People were like, "Oh man, we really love this character." Well, he had a smaller part in the book, the first issue originally, but because I saw that popularity growing, I decided to expand his arc a little bit more and give him a little bit more significance within the first issue and the story overall. And the room I gave myself allowed it just to fit right in place. Didn't have to tweak any of the story. It just kind of fit. Like, it made so much sense. I was like, of course, like, I'll expand this, I'll do this here, and it just works perfectly. So I try to keep that philosophy as much as possible, and make sure that I'm always appeasing the fans. And as long as I can keep the story good, as long as the story can stay the same, I want to make sure that the fans are getting excited about what they're getting and the characters they see on the in the book itself.
Yeah, that reminds me of something I heard George R. Martin say, where he was like, when you watch or when you read the first Game of Thrones book, um, you get this idea that there's like this whole vast world behind it, but really he has just like this raft, and then slowly over time he builds everything out
Yeah.
underneath it. I think that's what's cool about it is it's like when you're creating something like you have this idea of what you're doing, but then at the same time you can change it just the same way it is that you do with your drawing. Like
Yep.
I love when I sit down and I get a sketch going and I don't put too much on it and I just start inking, because that's kind of where you find like the actual drawing itself. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah, I like the creative freedom that and that's a great analogy that George put out there, and I would say that's quite a bit the same because I'm a big fan of of his. I haven't read a lot of the books, but I'm a fan of like his world building. I like how he
Hmm.
builds a world, and he's got times in a decade, like different eras of his world. Same thing with Tolkien, the way he kind of set out his world, and that's what I want to do in my book. So my book is kind of like a sci-fi adventure with a little bit of horror in there, but it's got a lot of elements of fantasy because I love fantasy storytelling. So when I set out to create my world, I didn't want to just have a world that consisted of modern day. Like, I wanted to have a history involved with the characters, and I've got a group of characters that are immortal characters called the Elder Sons, because I love immortals. You know, Highlander, going back to when I was a kid. Just it's always fun to have immortal characters because you can do so much with them because they're from the dawn of time to whenever. You know,
Yeah.
unless they're off in some way. But I wanted to have an immortal race that could take me all the way back to the beginning of time. And my book, my story, absolutely does kind of span the beginning of time to the end of time, even though I'm focused on one kind of more modern day aspect of it. But we can dip back and forth and even go forward if we want to within the story anytime with the characters that exist. And it gives me the ability to know kind of loosely that this character existed way back then. So there's so much I can do. I can develop, even if I haven't thought about it yet, I can develop
Hmm.
something because there's so much years of history with this character, you know.
Hmm.
Uh,
So was there like specific mythologies, or like you said, like Game of Thrones was an inspiration in the sense of like the scope of your world building? Like what specifically were you looking at to draw inspiration from?
uh, Probably more Tolkien than Game of Thrones than George R. R. Martin. Even though
Hmm.
I do love a lot of stuff he does, and I got into his stuff heavily during Game of Thrones. Obviously, like I would get into the lore because, like I said, I never read the books, but I was into the show, and so I'd do
Yeah.
some research onto what the books were, and I'd watch all these videos on YouTube of explaining like his ages, you know, of stuff. And I always thought that was really awesome, you know, to go to the first men or whatever it is that he has, and just how his world grew, and he could be like, yes, during this age this happened, this age this happened, blah blah blah, and Tolkien kind of did the same thing, you know. So those were two big things when I was looking at world building history. That was like, hey, I want different ages. I want this happen in the first age, this happen in the second age. You know, we're currently in like the third age of my world, but it exists within a version of the real world with a little bit of different mythologies pulled into it. But instead of using like actual mythology from the real world, I like would give different names to characters or change stuff
Hmm.
up. So it's my own kind of invented mythology.
Hmm.
A lot of it also comes from I'm a Christian. I grew up a religious person, and I still am. But
Hmm.
there's some fun stuff when you look at the religious mythology, I guess you could say, or
Hmm.
conspiracies within the religious world itself. There was a big thing I stumbled on one day that really gave me inspiration for the backstory of this book, and that was something called the gap theory. And the gap theory, if people don't understand, if you don't read the Bible, if you're not religious, you probably never heard of it. But in Genesis 1, it was, you know, God created the heavens and the earth.
Hmm.
Was verse 1, there's this theory that between verse 1 and verse 2, there was a gap of ages. And in that gap of ages were an untold number of years, of times, where
Hmm.
the original inhabitants of the world were created before Adam. And they, you know, had wars with the angels, and like all this stuff happened. It really gets very fanciful, you know, when you dive into these
Hmm.
theories, and whether it's true or not compared to the Bible, it doesn't matter. It sparked my interest when I was starting to think of like Tolkien and Game of Thrones, and I was starting to think of the gap theory and like all this kind of stuff. I'm like, well, yeah, like what if there was a time before time, you know? And in my book, I kind of call it the time before time, where these characters existed. And they're immortal characters, and they're responsible for all the great creations on this planet that we can't think of creating anymore, like the Great Pyramids, Atlantis, like all this stuff. Like somebody had to create those. Like why not be this ruling race of immortal humans were the people
Hmm.
that did this, you know? And so I started expanding the story wise with that, and just, you know, diving a little bit more and developing it, and it all fit really well. It fit with what I wanted to do. It gave my story a really rich back history that I could pull mythology from, and it directly ties into the main characters in the current day of the book, you know,
Hmm.
and going forward. So it's I talk more about the backstory than I probably should, because it's stuff that you should probably really discover when you're reading the book.
Hmm.
But the book is shrouded in mystery, so I don't try to talk too much about what's going on in the first issue, because I don't want to give away spoilers, because very much is a mystery that you're unfolding as the reader, as the main character unfolds, or it finds out the mystery as well. But I do like talking about the backstory so much, because it's stuff that I'm so into
Hmm.
when it comes to mythologies or ancient world. Like I love ancient world talk. I'm not an
Hmm.
expert on it by any
Hmm.
means, but I just love the idea of the ancient world. I love the idea of civilizations that died out long ago that we just hear whispers about, but they created these amazing
Hmm.
feats of things back in the day. And how did they do it? What was the
Hmm.
technology back then?
Hmm.
And with my characters, it was always like, well, they had technology comparable to ours or even beyond ours today. It was just all lost. How did it get lost? We'll figure that out. We'll talk about it at some point, but that's the
Hmm.
kind of stuff that really interests me. And I was like, I'm going to write about that. I'm going to create a world where that exists.
Yeah. Yeah, that's some cool inspiration to draw from. The ancient society stuff. Do you so you're talking about your faith had an inspiration on the story that you wrote. I, I guess this whole experience of this last year was kind of a was it a lesson in faith in a sense? I mean, like you had to basically just go for it.
I mean, I as a Christian, I feel like God directs my life
Sure.
wherever I go. That's just I've given him control of my life. So I believe that whatever direction I'm going in life, whether it's comics, whether it's working
Hmm.
full time jobs, my family, all that kind of stuff is directed specifically. All I have to do is kind of listen and go in that direction. So, in that aspect, I would say, yeah, the comic is. It wasn't a tool. And again, this kind of goes back to our conversation earlier. The comic wasn't a tool for me to put in any of my personal ideology or religious beliefs into the comic and create like this whatever, and that wasn't the case. Like I wanted to create a comic that was just relatable to everybody and that you could enjoy the story, but I did want to take all my influences and things that sparked my imagination. I'm a very imaginative person. I love conspiracy theories. I love just
Hmm.
anything that makes your mind think and just kind of contemplate stuff. And there's so much stuff that I got into over the last 10, 12 years that it was just almost begging to be written about. It's like, like there's so much stuff there to take and write a good story. And the religious part was definitely part of it. Like there was some things, like I said, that absolutely sparked my interest in creating characters and creating worlds.
Hmm.
Faith driven. I don't know, except for just like I allow God to take my life where it goes. Like that's probably the end of it. The book itself is probably more just like the imagination of my 14-year-old self is still very much in here talking, and wondering
Hmm.
all the time and just creating good stories, in my opinion, to put down on the page.
Yeah, you talking about God taking over control and steering your life. Yeah, I find that very relatable. I feel like that's something that a lot of creatives can relate to because what I meant specifically was, the idea of it can feel like a risk, right? Because like you're putting yourself out there, and there's always this part of your mind that's telling you
Mm.
that you should pick the quote unquote safer road and not go down this path. Um, I imagine it must be really mind blowing to at the beginning of you said this has been in production for basically a year whenever you started to put the book together, correct?
Yeah, when it first went on sale, it's been on sale for just a little bit over a year. So yeah, this entire year has been getting the funding to make the book and then making the book.
Okay, so Indiegogo allowed you to post it for sale for a year,
Yes. So
or
the way the crowdfunding works, or at least specifically on Indiegogo, because I've only really worked with Indiegogo, so I don't know specifically other crowdfunding platforms. But basically, crowdfunding is you present your product, and you have to have enough of it done to present what it's going to look like. And I had at the time I had 4 pages completely done, colored, so I could present like, hey, here's the feeling of the book, how it's going to look, here's the covers, here's variant covers, here's the breakdown of the story. And then I just tried to sell it as best I could, kind of like I would go on shows like this and I just talk about the book and show off the art. I really let the art sell the book quite a bit because that's kind of how I was trying to push it. But yeah, so you fund for a 60-day period where you're bringing in money, and then the campaign goes into something called in demand, which is basically like an online store. So theoretically, if the comic was already done, I could have funded it for a period of time and just left it in demand, and then if people had backed it in demand, they could have got it right off the bat. But since it's a crowdfunding where you're getting the book produced, you let everybody know up front, like, hey, this is something that we're taking money in so that we can afford to get these guys to ink the book and color the book and like all the money that it takes to create a comic book. And by the way, I'm gonna spend a year working on this book to get it out in your hands, you know, so everything's up front. And that's why some people don't back the campaign until like right at the end, when the book is getting ready to come out, which makes a lot of sense. But yeah, that's the way the crowdfunding of the Indiegogo works. So it allowed me to be in demand, so to speak, I guess you could say, just working on the book for the last year and getting the thing out. And being my first book, I wanted to make sure I took time and did it right and not try to rush through, because it is a lot of money you're asking people to invest into you. You're asking $25 for a comic book where you can go to a comic book store and get a book for $5-6, you know. But the idea is to help fund the creator to get the book out, because comics are expensive to make. I don't think people really realize how much it takes to make a comic. You don't think about it because you're like, comics are so cheap at the LCSs because they're being mass produced by big companies. You know, they can afford to put a book out for $3, $4, $5, $6, and even though they're probably paying like maybe 30 grand to get the book actually made, you know, but they're going to make all that money back very quick. You know, with independent creators, we don't have that luxury. We got to make sure everything is paid for up front and sent out. So that's why you have a heavy price tag on the comic book, but you get a pristine like version of the book. So if I was to ever put this book in the store, which is definitely my plan, after I have 4 issues out and complete the first story arc, I want to get it into the stores. It'll be a cheaper version of the book. What I mean is, through the crowdfunder, you're going to get higher quality paper and higher quality cover and like all that kind of stuff. So you get something for your money. Whereas if you're going to mass produce it, you're going to go with lighter paperweights and stuff like that. Kind of like what you see on the shelves today, where my comic is going to have a thicker cardstock cover and like all this kind of stuff. So it's going to feel a little bit more quality to it. It's really the only way that independents right now can get books created and put out. Some make a very good living off of doing it. You know, others are still just trying to get by, but it allows us to get the books out to the consumer.
Okay, so whenever you're trying to launch your own independent comic, you have to have you have to have some sort of like some sort of collectible or some sort of variant variation that's kind of separating you from the competition. Like they're getting something more than just the comic. They're getting like this special version of the comic.
Yeah, exactly. So besides just that, you know, you can have variant covers of the book as well. But like I said, so the version that you're getting in the campaign is the only version that's going to be printed like that off the campaign. So when I say pristine, you know, maybe they have a foil cover, or maybe there's something to it that is going to make it stand out from anything else. If my book goes into the store, it's going to be produced on cheaper, I guess you could say, product. So if you look at a normal comic today, a normal floppy comic that Marvel or DC puts out, that to me is a cheaper version of what you get from the crowdfunding. Not that it's bad in quality. Cheap doesn't necessarily mean bad. It's just, you know, the cover weight is about the same as the interior paper weight, you know.
Okay.
Whereas my book, the cover weight is going to be a nice kind of a harder cardstock. It's going to have sturdiness to it. The interior paper is going to be a thicker paper, just thicker quality paper, more durable, all that kind of stuff. If I was to put the book into stores after it's out, the version is going to be a cheaper version. So you will never see the version that you get from the Indiegogo campaign in the stores or on the shelves. It becomes an instant collectible for that campaign. It will never be printed again. Like anybody that gets books off of this campaign, the printing will stop after that. I'm going to print as many as I can to fulfill the campaign, and then some extras to sell or to make sure that any damaged comics can be replaced. But that's it. That version will never be printed again. If I do a version of issue 1 again on the second campaign of issue 2, it would be a brand new cover, you know, as a catch-up tier. You know, so it becomes instant collectibles, which is kind of, if you're a collector out there, it's kind of the draw of the Indiegogo campaigns. Plus, we give a bunch of extras. Like a lot of people have stretch goals. You hit a certain number of funds, you're going to throw in extra things. You're going to get like trading cards. You're going to get prints. You're going to get who knows? I mean, people have done stickers and buttons, like all this kind of stuff. Some people just go crazy with the different tchotchkes or stuff like that. You're going to get extra with just backing one book. So hopefully, when the campaign does good and you get that book in the mail, you get the book and you get all this fun extra stuff that you don't know what to do with.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that sounds really cool. So, what publisher or what printing house are you using? Are you using any of the? I know there's a couple that like everybody uses, right?
Well,
There's a couple.
it really is up to you to do research on figuring out where you want to get stuff printed. Like some people don't like getting stuff printed in Japan, and they
Mhm,
rarely get stuff printed in the States. So that's a big sticker for some creators. We'll specifically look for United States printers.
mhm,
Um, and sometimes there are smaller printers that have better prices, compared to the bigger printers. So it's just a research. Every creator kind of has to do their own research into that. But like the popular ones are like Print Ninja, which I think is a foreign printer, but people have used that quite a bit in the indie scene. Mixum is another printer that people work. Comics Wellspring, stuff like that. Is popular amongst people I know, and then smaller printers as well. It's basically it's whatever you want to do, as long as the quality that you are trying to achieve is there by the printer. You could basically use anybody, and then production wise is just you. So you get your
mhm.
books in, you pack them up, and then you send them out directly to the consumer. So you don't have to worry about doing anything like with Diamond or Penguin, publishing or all that kind of stuff that the indies do in the comic book stores. This is a direct from me to you, the consumer,
Mm,
transaction. And I think that's what's cool about the crowdfunding as well. It's a little bit more intimate in a way, that I am packaging up your book by hand and I'm mailing it out to you by hand. I think that's kind of cool.
yeah, that is pretty cool. It also adds it also adds that other tier of like like we made the book. It took so long to make this book, and then now you've got this other side of it. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, I think it's really cool what you've done. It's a huge inspiration to me, really. Like
Thank you.
I'm trying to dip my toes into the comic stuff, and when I came across your work, I was like, man, this guy's art, like you were saying, like it reminds me of all the stuff it is that I grew up with. And you look at your work and just go like, what happened? Like, why can't our comics just be fun like this
Yeah.
again? And it's cool to see people still doing that. Um, so I feel like we're getting close to an hour. I know you don't have a whole lot of time. So I guess let us know. We can find you on Indiegogo. I'm going to put your Twitter and everything down below.
Okay. Yeah,
Yep.
you can find me on any social media. Just type in Joe Sonntag or Joe M Sonntag. You'll find me. I'm primarily on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it nowadays. I just found that was a better platform for the people that were back in the book at the time. But you can find me on any social media. If anybody ever has questions, my DMs are always free. I'm always willing to talk to people, unless you're spamming me, and then no. But yeah, Reaper Destroyer is my book. It's an action sci-fi adventure. It's everything you love about the dark heroes of the '90s with a modern day twist on it. You can find that on Indiegogo. There will be a link below. We are getting ready to close that campaign. If you guys check it out and you think it's something you like, please consider backing it. You have probably a little over a month to back the first issue, and again, it'll never be printed again. This version of the campaign will never be printed again. So it definitely becomes collectors if you like any of the covers that we have available. And yeah, just help support independent creators. This is really the way that we can. Some of us make a living doing it, but really, more importantly, it's just the way that we can get our stories out and give an alternative to the mainstream right now. If you are disenfranchised by reading some of the stuff, you don't like the way your favorite character is being handled or certain stuff they're putting in your comics, come to the indie scene, come to what we're doing, because it really is all about trying to tell a really fun story, a good story that everybody can connect with, and just give you that 15, 20, 30 minutes, however long it takes you to read it, of escapism. So I appreciate
Yeah.
everybody out there.
Yeah. I appreciate you coming on and chatting with me, man. This is
That
cool.
was fun, man. I appreciate having me on. This was great.
So yeah, you were listening to the World of Art and Magic podcast. Next week, I'm going to have Reinstall Paul. He's another YouTuber. We're going to be talking about David Lynch and a bunch of other strange
Ah,
art stuff. So this podcast comes out every Friday, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. And yeah, thanks for listening to it. Give me a follow. All the links for Joe's stuff is in the description, and as well as my own work. And thanks, guys, for listening.
thank you, everyone.